A reading from the Book of Wisdom. There is no God other than you who cares for everything, to whom you might have to prove that you never judged unjustly. Your justice has its source in strength. Your sovereignty over all makes you lenient to all. You show your strength when your sovereign power is questioned, and you expose the insolence of those who know it. But, disposing of such strength, you are mild in judgment. You govern us with great lenience, for you have only to will, and your power is there. By acting thus, you have taught a lesson to your people, how the virtuous man must be kindly to his fellow men. And you have given your sons the good hope that after sin you will grant repentance. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
O Lord, you are good and forgiving. O Lord, you are good and forgiving, full of love to all who call. Give heed, O Lord, to my prayer, and attend to the sound of my voice. O Lord, you are good and forgiving. All the nations shall come to adore you and glorify your name, O Lord. For you are great and do marvelous deeds. You alone are God. O Lord, you are good and forgiving. But you, God of mercy and compassion, slow to anger, O Lord, abounding in love and truth, turn and take pity on me. O Lord, you are good and forgiving.
A reading from the letter to the Romans. The Spirit comes to help us in our weakness. For when we cannot choose words in order to pray properly, the Spirit Himself expresses our plea in a way that could never be put into words. And God, who knows everything in our hearts, knows perfectly well what He means, and that the pleas of the saints expressed by the Spirit are according to the mind of God. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Blessed are you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, for revealing the mysteries of the kingdom to your children.
The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus put a parable before the crowds. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. While everybody was asleep, his enemy came, sowed darnel all among the wheat, and made off. When the new wheat sprouted and ripened, the darnel appeared as well. The owner's servants went to him and said, "Sir, was it not good seed that you sowed in your field? If so, where does the darnel come from?" "Some enemy has done this," he answered. And the servant said, "Do you want us to go and weed it out?" But he said, "No, because when you weed out the darnel, you might pull up the wheat with it. Let them both grow till harvest, and at the harvest time I'll say to the reapers, 'First collect the darnel and tie it in bundles to be burnt, then gather the wheat into my barn.'" The Gospel of the Lord. I was visiting some years ago. I remember very clearly, actually, it was after a First Communion celebration, so it was this sort of time of year. And the children were all out playing in the garden, and the adults, we were all in the kitchen having a cup of tea or whatever was on offer. And the mum of the house kept going to the French windows and shouting, "Leave Peter alone." After a couple of shouts, I said, "You're obviously concerned, is Peter being bullied?" "No," she said, "it's right. Peter isn't one of the children. Peter was their rabbit." So I said, "Oh, are they not allowed to play with the rabbit?" She said, "Well, they were when it was alive, but it died about a week ago." She said, "We buried it in the garden, and they keep digging it up to see what's happened to it next." And with that, she shouted out the French windows, "Leave Peter alone." Seems to me at least the children were open-minded. They were curious. They wanted to know what happens next. Unlike the Pharisees and others who we hear often in the gospel are very closed-minded about what happens next. They've decided that once people have made their choice, their future is sealed, what will happen after death already clear. Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners is a question which, as you know, preoccupies them. This parable, seems to me, is the answer. If, like me, you're not a gardener, you won't be able to tell from a first sprouting that which is the weed and that which is the plant. In truth, such is my ability with such things, I'm not entirely sure when they're full grown. It seems to me that some weeds can be quite beautiful. And not being farmers, we won't really understand about the darnel and the wheat, but my researches tell me that young darnel, young wheat, almost identical. It's not until they've been allowed to mature and develop that you finally get to tell which is which. And then at the end, as we heard, the wheat and the weed can be separated. It takes patience and restraint. The Pharisees, of course, should have recognized this patience as being a hallmark of God. They're well versed in the scriptures. Why have they forgotten that first reading that we have just heard? A reminder, you are mild in judgment. You govern us with great lenience. And as it reflects on this generosity, on this patience of God, it says, by acting thus, you have taught a lesson to your people, how the virtuous man must be kindly to his fellow men, and you've given your sons the good hope that after sin you will grant repentance. Time and time again, God had shown that lenience to his people. But the Pharisees have not learnt the lesson. And indeed, down through the ages, generation after generation have not learnt the lesson to leave judgment to God, to allow people to mature before judging them, to allow people to change. Unless, of course, you've experienced it for yourself, perhaps as St. Paul had done. That second reading today is not directly connected to the other readings, but it's from one of St. Paul's letters. A man who persecuted the Christians, who would simply have been rejected by them. But they were open to God, and his action in life, as indeed was St. Paul open, it turned out, to God's action in his. And so he can now write, "The Spirit comes to help us in our weakness. For when we cannot choose words in order to pray properly, the Spirit himself expresses our plea in a way that could never be put into words. And God, who knows everything in our hearts, knows perfectly well what he means, and that the pleas of the saints expressed by the Spirit are according to the mind of God." Now, wonderful words which deserve repeating and reflecting upon. Might be something we set ourselves over the next hours, over the next days, just to read that reading again, to allow ourselves to absorb that great joy. We have been reminded over these weeks that we are called to be saints. It's the call that we received at our baptism. And we're invited to pray for each other, to pray for mutual encouragement, and that the forgiveness that will enable us all to live according to the mind of God. It was there too if the Pharisees had looked for it in the words of the psalm. "O Lord, you are good and forgiving." That forgiveness which allows us to live according to the mind of God.